In January 1993, a wall of water came down the Salt River at 140,000 cubic feet per second, and it arrived at the one place least prepared to receive it, a construction site. Because at that exact moment, Theodore Roosevelt Dam, the structure that had held back this river for 80 years, was half torn apart and half rebuilt, wrapped in scaffolding and cranes. Its temporary barriers holding back a reservoir climbing toward the highest level in its history. The flood overtopped those barriers, poured through a spillway that was only partly built, and cascaded down onto the powerhouse below. It was the precise disaster the engineers were racing to prevent, and it showed up before they had finished preventing it. This is the story of how one of America's most historic dams was found, decades after it was built, to be incapable of surviving the worst flood it might ever face, and of the extraordinary and strangely tragic effort to fix that before the river made the point for them. Everything in it is documented in Bureau of Reclamation records. And the first thing to clear up is a common confusion, because it changes what this story actually is. Roosevelt Dam is not on the Colorado River. You hear a great deal about an Arizona water crisis, and most of it is about the Colorado, about Lake Mead and Lake Powell dropping toward record lows, about the Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam and the long drought squeezing the entire Southwest. That is a real and serious crisis, but it is a different one, on a different river, about different dams. Theodore Roosevelt Dam sits on the Salt River and Tonto Creek, about 80 miles northeast of Phoenix. It holds back Roosevelt Lake, which is the largest lake or reservoir located entirely within the state of Arizona. Mead and Powell are bigger, but they straddle state lines and belong to the Colorado. Roosevelt is the anchor of the Salt River Project, a chain of dams that supplies more than half of the water used in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And here is the part that turns the usual story on its head. Roosevelt and the Salt River system are not a victim of the Colorado River crisis. They are part of what protects Phoenix from it, a separate, more secure supply that cushions the city against the cuts coming down the Colorado. The threat to Roosevelt Dam was never drought pushing a reservoir too low. It was the opposite. It was water, and the fear that one day there would be far too much of it. To understand that, you have to go back to what this dam was, and why it was a monument. Construction began in 1903 at the confluence of the Salt River and Tonto Creek, deep in rugged country between the Sierra Ancha, Mazatzal, and Superstition Mountains. It was one of the first 5 projects authorized under the 1902 Reclamation Act, the law, signed by President Theodore Roosevelt himself, that created the Federal Reclamation Service and set out to make the arid West habitable through irrigation. Roosevelt Dam was the flagship. Devastating floods interrupted the construction in 1905, but by 1911 it was finished, and it was staggering for its time, a cyclopean rubble masonry thick arch dam, enormous, rough-cut stone blocks laid up into a curved wall, standing 280 feet high, 723 feet long at the crest. It was the tallest masonry dam in the world. The reservoir behind it was, for a time, the largest artificial lake on Earth. On the 18th of March, 1911, the former president traveled to the remote site and pressed a button to release the first water from the dam that bore his name. If there could be any monument which would appeal to any man, he told the crowd. Surely this is it. He was not exaggerating the stakes. Before the dam, the Salt River had been wildly, dangerously erratic, a river that swung between catastrophic floods, like the 1891 flood that inundated the Phoenix Valley and destroyed the early canal works, and brutal droughts that ruined the farmers and ranchers who had settled there. The people of the Salt River Valley wanted this dam so badly that they staked everything they owned on it. In 1903, the valley's landowners banded together and pledged their own land as collateral to guarantee repayment of the federal loan that would build the dam, hundreds of thousands of acres put on the line as security. That organization became the foundation of the Salt River Project, the entity that still runs Roosevelt Dam today. It is hard to overstate how existential this was for them. The alternative to the dam was not inconvenience. It was watching their farms wash away one year and wither the next, as they had been doing for a generation. Modern Phoenix, its agriculture, its cities, its very existence at that scale, was made possible by this dam taming that river. In 1963, it was designated a National Historic Landmark. In 1970, the American Society of Civil Engineers named it a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. It was, by every measure, one of the most important and revered structures in the American West. And then, more than 60 years after it was built, engineers looked at it with modern eyes and realized it might not survive. The turning point for American dam safety was the failure of another reclamation dam. In June of 1976, the Teton Dam in Idaho, a brand new earthen dam, failed catastrophically as its reservoir filled for the first time, releasing a flood that killed 11 people and caused enormous damage. Teton was a national trauma for the engineering profession, and it triggered a fundamental reckoning. The Teton failure was so shocking precisely because the dam was new. This was not a crumbling relic, it was a modern federal dam, designed by the same Bureau of Reclamation that was regarded as one of the premier dam-building organizations in the world, and it came apart the very first time it was filled, water finding a path through the earthen structure and eroding it from the inside until a section simply washed away, sending a torrent down the valley below. If the experts could get a new dam that wrong, the obvious and frightening question was, what about the old ones? What about the hundreds of aging dams built decades earlier to standards no one had seriously revisited since? Congress passed the Reclamation Safety of Dams Act, and the Bureau of Reclamation began systematically reevaluating its aging dams against modern safety standards. Standards far more demanding than the ones those dams had been designed to, decades earlier. When they applied those standards to Roosevelt Dam, they found two serious problems. The first involved a concept called the Probable Maximum Flood. The Probable Maximum Flood, or PMF, is exactly what it sounds like, the worst flood that hydrologists can realistically construct for a given watershed. The theoretical maximum, the combination of the most extreme rainfall and runoff conditions physically possible in that basin. Modern dam safety practice requires that a major dam be able to pass its PMF without failing, and the analysis showed that Roosevelt Dam could not. Its spillways and its crest were not adequate to handle the maximum flood the Salt River watershed could throw at it. In a truly extreme event, the water could overtop the dam, and overtopping is one of the surest ways to destroy a dam, as the water pours over the top and erodes it from the downstream side until it collapses. That vulnerability is not abstract, and it is worth understanding why it is so feared. A dam is designed to hold water back, not to have water flow over the top of it. The whole structure, especially an older masonry or earthen one, assumes the reservoir stays below the crest, with excess water routed safely down purpose-built spillways. When a flood is too big for the spillways, the reservoir keeps rising until it spills over the crest itself, and now fast-moving water is running down the face and the base of a structure never built to survive that. It tears at the foundation, undermines the toe, and can unzip a dam in hours. A significant fraction of the dam failures in history have happened this way. So when engineers said Roosevelt could not pass its probable maximum flood, they were saying something specific and grave, that in the worst plausible flood, the most important dam in central Arizona could be overtopped and lost, with Phoenix and its suburbs strung out along the river below. The second problem was seismic. Engineers determined that a maximum credible earthquake, the largest earthquake reasonably expected to occur near the dam, could potentially cause the aging masonry structure to fail. So here was a national historic landmark, a monument to the founding of the modern West, a dam that had stood for over 70 years and that the entire city of Phoenix depended on. And it was, by contemporary engineering standards, unsafe against both of the two great threats to any dam, the maximum flood and the maximum earthquake. It had been living, quietly, past the edge of its own safe limit for decades, and no one had known. Congress approved safety modifications in 1984, and the plan they eventually settled on was audacious. They would not demolish the historic dam and start over. Instead, they would encase it. They would build a new, larger, far stronger concrete dam around and over the old masonry structure, swallowing the 1911 dam inside a modern one, and raising the whole thing 77 feet, from 280 feet to 357 feet tall. The added height would do two things: give the reservoir a dedicated flood control space it had never had, and let the structure safely pass the probable maximum flood that the original could not. The scale of the work was immense. Over 8 years of construction, crews poured roughly 450,000 cubic yards of new concrete and placed some 840 miles of reinforcing steel, transforming the rubble masonry arch into a composite concrete and masonry structure. Consider the engineering problem for a moment, because it is genuinely difficult in a way that is easy to miss. This was not a demolition and a fresh start on an empty site. Roosevelt Lake was still there, still full of water, still needing to be held back the entire time. The city downstream still needed its water supply, so the crews had to build a new, taller, heavier dam directly onto and around the old one, while the old one continued doing its job, bonding fresh concrete to century-old masonry, working from the faces and the top of a live dam with a reservoir pressing against it, and managing the water level throughout, so the construction zone stayed workable. The old masonry itself complicated everything, joining modern reinforced concrete to a cyclopean rubble wall built in 1911 is not a standard procedure, and much of the project was effectively invented as it went. The final cost came to around $430 million, approximately 43 times what the original dam had cost to build. Because the modification raised the water level and would flood the old roadway across the dam, an entirely new bridge had to be built, the graceful 1,080-foot Roosevelt Lake Bridge, which carried the highway traffic off the dam and across the lake. And the money came from a coalition that shows how many interests depended on this one structure, the Bureau of Reclamation. The Federal Highway Administration, the Salt River Project, the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, the Arizona Department of Transportation, the Maricopa County Flood District, and 6 Phoenix area cities, Chandler, Glendale, Mesa, Phoenix, Scottsdale, and Tempe. And then, in the middle of it all, the river tested them. January 1993 brought record rainfall to the Salt River watershed. On the 8th of January, the peak inflow into the reservoir hit 140,000 cubic feet per second, a torrent. Over the following days, the reservoir climbed and climbed, and on the 19th of January, it reached an elevation of 2,139.1 feet, the highest level in the entire history of the dam. But the dam was not finished. It was a construction site, its permanent spillways not yet complete. The reservoir held in check partly by temporary structures called cofferdams, barriers meant to keep water out of the work area while the permanent dam was built. The rising lake overtopped the left abutment cofferdam. Water spilled over that temporary barrier and continued to pour over it for nearly 2 days. It discharged through the partially constructed left spillway and cascaded down onto the powerhouse below, causing about $1 million in damage and setting the entire project back roughly 6 months. Engineers were forced to open the spillway gates in February and continued releasing water into March. Sit with what that meant. The whole reason this dam was being rebuilt was that it could not safely handle an extreme flood. And while it was being rebuilt, while it was at its most vulnerable, its defenses half assembled, an extreme flood arrived and pushed the reservoir to a record high, overtopping the temporary works and damaging the powerhouse. It was a near miss that proved the entire premise of the project in real time. The threat was not theoretical. The Salt River really could deliver a flood large enough to overwhelm the old design, and it had just done so, as if to demonstrate exactly why the $430 million rebuild could not come fast enough. The engineers absorbed the blow, repaired the damage, and kept building. They finished in 1996. On the 12th of April that year, 85 years after Theodore Roosevelt had opened the original, a rededication ceremony was held at the transformed dam. It now stood 357 feet high, its ancient masonry sealed inside a smooth modern concrete face, with more than one. 8 million acre-feet of flood surcharge storage, and the ability to survive the maximum flood and the maximum earthquake that had defeated its predecessor on paper. By the measures that matter, it was one of the safest large dams in the country. But the rebuild came with a strange and genuinely poignant cost, and it is the detail that stays with you. The transformation was so complete that the historic dam, as a historic object, no longer existed. The rough stone monument that Theodore Roosevelt had dedicated was now entombed inside a concrete shell, invisible, its original design and materials and workmanship no longer legible. And so in 1999, the National Park Service formally withdrew Roosevelt Dam's status as a National Historic Landmark. The structure had lost the very historic integrity that made it a landmark. To save the dam and the valley below it, they had, in a sense, been forced to destroy the monument. The thing that made Phoenix possible was preserved by erasing the thing that commemorated it. So let me be clear and honest about where the dam stands today, because it is the reverse of what a panic headline would suggest. Theodore Roosevelt Dam is not a structure under pressure, teetering at its limit. It is a structure that was found to be at its limit 40 years ago, and was then deliberately and expensively taken past that danger. It is modernized, seismically strengthened, and equipped to handle floods the original could not. It continues to operate as the anchor of the Salt River Project, supplying more than half the water used across the Phoenix metropolitan area. The 1993 flood that overwhelmed the half-built construction site is precisely the kind of event the finished dam is now built to manage. If anything, Roosevelt is a rare good news story in American dam safety, a dangerous deficiency identified in time, funded, and fixed before it could kill anyone. And that is worth dwelling on, because it is the exception, not the rule. Roosevelt was rehabilitated because it fell under the Bureau of Reclamation's Safety of Dams program, born from the Teton catastrophe, which forced a hard look at old federal dams against modern standards. That look is what found the flaw. Most of the country's dams have never had that scrutiny, and the numbers are sobering. The nation has tens of thousands of dams, the majority of them more than half a century old. A study by the Association of State Dam Safety Officials estimated that rehabilitating the nation's dams would cost tens of billions of dollars, with many billions needed just for the most critical, highest hazard structures. The American Society of Civil Engineers, which grades the nation's infrastructure, has for years given America's dams a grade of D, and the count of dams classified as high hazard, meaning failure would likely cause loss of life, has risen into the thousands as development spreads into the valleys below them. It is the same underlying condition that produced the near catastrophe at Oroville Dam in California in 2017. And that keeps a small army of engineers permanently at work reinforcing Louisville Lake Dam above Dallas. Aging dams, built to the standards and the climate assumptions of their era, quietly carrying risks that only reveal themselves when someone finally checks, or when the water finally comes. Roosevelt was fortunate in a way most are not. It belonged to an agency with a dedicated safety program, a mandate to act, and, eventually, the money to do the work. Roosevelt is what it looks like when the system works, when the check happens in time and the money gets spent. The 1993 flood is what it looks like when the timing is nearly too tight anyway. And the difference between those two outcomes and a genuine disaster is, more often than anyone would like, a matter of whether someone looked hard at the worst case before the worst case arrived. There is one more layer to the honesty here, and it returns to where we started. The real water crisis facing Arizona is severe, but it is not a Roosevelt Dam crisis, and it is not a structural one. It is the slow drought crisis of the Colorado River playing out at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, where the reservoirs that supply much of the Southwest have fallen toward levels that threaten both water deliveries and hydropower. Arizona is on the front line of that crisis. Under the shortage agreements on the Colorado, the state's Central Arizona project takes some of the deepest cuts of anyone. And it is exactly there that Roosevelt Dam and the Salt River system matter most, not as a casualty, but as a hedge. The Salt and Verta rivers give Phoenix a supply that is separate from the embattled Colorado, and a chain of dams like Roosevelt to store it. The city's long-term security depends in part on that separate system continuing to hold. As of this afternoon, the 25th of July 2026, the modified dam stands above the Tonto Basin as it has for 30 years since the rebuild. Its concrete face, holding back Roosevelt Lake, the old 1911 masonry monument sealed silent inside it, the flood control space kept empty and waiting for the next big water year. It is not a wall at the edge of failure. It is a wall that was once found to be at that edge and was pulled back from it by a decade of work and a great deal of money, the exact thing that the dams which do fail never got in time. The river will rise again someday, as it did in 1993, as it has for as long as there has been a salt river. The difference now is that the dam is finally built for it. That is not drama. That is what it looks like when a warning is heard before it becomes a tragedy, which, in the long and often unlucky history of American dams, is the rarest outcome of all.